Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Tennessee Williams and New Orleans Literary Festival. I'm Cynthia Morgan Babst, a writer here in New Orleans and a member of the festival's board. And I'm so thrilled to be speaking with Jocelyn Nicole Johnson, author of My Monticello, a debut collection of short fiction whose title novella is set to become a Netflix film, I think. Not only that, the book was named one of Time Magazine's 10 best fiction books for 2021. And a New York Times and Washington Post notable book of the year. It's a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award, the Kirkus Prize, and the National Book Critics Circle Leonard Prize. I must say personally, it's been so exhilarating watching your meteoric rise, Jocelyn. I still remember where I was sitting when I read Control Negro, the story that was published in Guernica in My Monticello. For the first time, I was lying on the couch downstairs reading slush, kind of in a dull and grumpy mood. And I clicked your submission open, and I think that my brain might have exploded. I read it straight through once. I read it straight through again. I texted all of the editors. I was like, holy shit. Everyone needs to read this immediately. It needs to be published right now. And it was, of course, everybody else who read it has had the exact same reaction. I don't think I've ever seen a short story go off like that, from Roxane Gay's attention to being in Best American Short Fiction, to LeVar Burton reading it on stage in New York City. It must be dizzying for you.
Yeah. Well, hi, Morgan. Thank you. I'm so nice to see you. Yeah, that's so nice. I've never heard you tell that story exactly of how you read it and emailing other people, but it was so wonderful because anyone who's written stories before knows that doesn't usually happen. You usually get like a tepid email that says, try again next time, so it was really nice to have like this excited group of people email me. It was pretty amazing.
Well, I think the entire world was excited the first time they read it. It wasn't anything unique about us. But I mean, it really is an astonishing story. And if anybody watching hasn't read it yet, I really encourage you to go and find it right this second. Find the book, find the story. I promise we won't be offended if you pause us for 15 minutes while you go and read it. It actually would be, I think that this conversation is going to be a phenomenal tool for anybody reading or studying that story or writing in general. And I mean, we don't have LeVar Burton today, but we have the author, which is better. Would you mind reading to us from Control Negro?
Sure. I'm going to read just such a small little snippet. I'm just going to read from the very beginning. So My Monticello has 5 stories in a novella, and Control Negro is the opening story of the collection. And all right. Control Negro. By the time you read this, you may have figured it out. Perhaps your mother told you, though she was only privy to my time-worn thesis, never my aim or full intention. Still, maybe the truth of it breached your insides, that I am your father, that you are my son. In these typewritten pages, I mean to make manifest the truth, the whole. But please do not mistake this letter for some manner of veiled confession. I cannot afford to be sorry, not for any of it. I hope you'll come to understand it was all for a grander good. You see, I needed a Control Negro, grotesque as that may sound. So I'm just going to stop there with the conceit of the Control Negro.
I mean, those two words together, even just in the contents, in the submission pile, they're such a, sort of a punch in the face. As the narrator says, it wasn't lost on me, the agitation of those two words linked together, that archaic descriptor clanking off the end like a rusted shackle. But all your titles, from My Monticello, The King of Xandria, they not only beautifully encapsulate your stories, but they're double, sometimes even triple entendres. They make us read them straight and then with irony and then with dead seriousness again. And I also feel like they pack an immediate emotional wallop. It's my Monticello. Virginia is not your home. And, I find titling very difficult. And I wonder what your titling process is. Do they precede the work, follow it? And how do you know when you've got the title that the work needs?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really do like titles. A lot of times, not always, but I would say a good 75% of the time, those titles come really early and they're just immediately, it's just like a gut instinct. Like that title was there at the beginning of that piece. And I almost wrote to the title, and the title informed what the story became. Well, I'll talk about a couple pieces. So you mentioned the King of Xandria, right? So that's a story about this Nigerian father who's immigrated to Alexandria, Virginia. And, the title comes, I love that it sounds almost like speculative middle grade. It has like this, It sounds like a different kind of story than it is, right?
Yeah, the way that it starts with an X, you're like a world, a place that starts with an X.
What is this Xandria?
King of, yeah.
But the way that this Nigerian father thinks of this is Alexandria is such a foreign place to him, and his son is named Alex. So he kind of like peels off part of his son's name to kind of make it this other place, the way it feels to him. But the irony is his son, is a young person. And so he like finds this place like home. So this way he wants to separate the two. His son is like, no, this is where we are, and this is where we have to survive, and so forth. Or you talked about My Monticello, like that title. It's so simple, right? It's something you really well known, Monticello. It's a symbol of Thomas Jefferson and of, America in this certain way. But then the my there, it just begs a bunch of questions, like whose Monticello is it? Who is this person? In this case, it's a young woman who's calling it hers, and why is she calling it hers, and who even owns this history to begin with, and what should we think about that, which is a central question of the collection and a central question of that story. And then for Control Negro, I wasn't sure with that story if it should exist in the world, like if someone was going to come and like cart me away for having written it. But that word, it does a bunch of different things. There's the scientific, the conceit in the story is that a scientific control, a control Negro, a person who's a scientific control as this father's observing something. But then there's also this idea of, Black people and people of color having to show such control and restraint in the face of, devastation, in the face of violence, in the face of a confrontation with police, or even an interaction with police. There's this way, it's like control. You have to be so controlled. The amount of restraint that you're expected to have is ridiculous, and impossible, honestly. And then there's also this way in which I just was playing with the idea of the names of Black people. So in that story, it spans, the father's writing a letter describing his life, and he talks about colored people and Negroes and Black people and African American people and POCs. So there's this way in which all these different names have come about, how people are naming themselves and being named as this desire to change conditions to make things better. But there's this circular feeling like, things are getting better, but they also are getting worse, or things are getting better in one way, but they're just this, they feel familiar in these other ways. So those were, but often I'll come to it and I'll write towards it. Once I see what it is, it'll contain something that I need to figure out. And then when I'm looking at it later, I kind of push back and think, what else can this mean? What else can this mean? What else can this mean?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, they're so concentrated. Even just talking about your book with people who haven't read any stories in it, haven't encountered it before, I say it's called My Monticello, and they look at me like, whose? Which is, I mean, it's just amazing how that one little possessive in the front does that. They're incredibly effective. And so, I mean, you've talked about it a little bit about writing into these loaded images, but I'm wondering about your inspiration for the stories as a whole. I think that's something that aspiring writers, often struggle with, like, where are we getting our ideas from if they don't like fly down on us out of the sky? I mean, on page 3 of this story, you write sort of an origin story of the experiment in the the story Control Negro, the narrator says, everyone has an origin story and this is yours. It began as a thought fully formed and sprung from my head. No, you were more like a determined line of questions, marching all together towards a momentous thrashing. And reading it, I couldn't help thinking about the origin of this story itself, which definitely has a momentous thrashing that it marches towards. And I wondered if that was a description of the way you come to your ideas.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there's a bit of just luck and magic and your mind getting in that place. Often I'll have a character, a voice, and like a start or something that's agitating me, that's a beginning place. But I don't have, and I might even have like, I have a mood and like maybe a glimpse of the end, but I just kind of have to write to it. Like I'm like, something needs to, how are these things going to coalesce? So I really do have kind of more the beginning images in the voice often. And the rest is coming through the process. But then once I get, a lot of times the end that I write first will remain, and it's more the excavation and the editing and the really thinking about things comes for the middle. So the end and the beginning often remain the same, and I'll end up, again, like I'll have that title. What else could that mean? Where else can I push on this idea of control, in the story? Or what if I like, a lot of times if you're lucky, you'll have something there and it's not quite right, but it's kind of a placeholder in your mind saying it needs something here. It needs another interaction, or it needs the tension, or it needs a release of tension, or whatever it is. And then you kind of can come back with the help of, readers, trusted readers, writing groups, and other people. I will say that line about a determined line of questions marching all together to a momentous thrashing. I was really, really thinking about, civil rights. I was thinking about like John Lewis crossing a bridge, this idea, because it kind of comes in this part where he's talking about, Vietnam and civil rights and, what the people in his community were doing and how he fit into that. And so, but it really does work. Like in the story is definitely a series of questions about what can America do for me? How will I fit into this place? And so it's really interesting to just, with short stories, you're always trying to point everything towards everything else, and find ways to connect them. And you don't have to necessarily think it through. Your subconscious does a lot of that work for you.
Yeah. And in that way, I love the word excavation that you use, because I think there's often something in our first drafts that has to be, kind of mined and refined, that, so many of our ideas and themes pre-exist our understanding of them.
Absolutely.
And yeah, you take them out and you elaborate, and then you have something extraordinary. So as you've said, this is a story of a troubled man and his secret research, an experiment designed painstakingly to mark the route of a Black child, one who I could prove was so strikingly decent and true that America could not find fault in him unless we as a nation had put it there. To do this, he carefully orchestrates the life of his son and maps it onto that of an aggregate ACM, which is another one of those words that you're using in American Caucasian male, taking the idea of whiteness as the default to like scientific fictional extremes. This dangerous experiment enacted on the body of a Black child made me think of Tuskegee, various horrific experiments, like I remember learning about in Psych 101, like the Milgram experiment on obedience, in which subjects were told to administer electric shocks to people taking a test. In this case, as in that one, the shocks are fake, but the experiment is in no way harmless. And I wonder if you had specific inspirations for this experimenter in this experiment.
Yeah, so the story really came out, the first wave of the story came out of this idea of a real event that happened here in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2015, where this, UVA student was bloodied by officers, like in a very public space. And there was a video and there was national attention on this. And it was me figuring out like, what does that mean and how does it feel? But the idea of this father, where did that come from? That's, absolutely just from my apparently twisted imagination, and this idea of this experiment, right? So this experiment, this father's going to come. The only thing I could it came to me, and I don't know how, but I will say that I had a friend in college many, many years ago who had mentioned this, what she described as an experiment that this professor had done, where he basically compared, he had compared the plight of Black people as a people in America, and the struggles of Black people to other immigrant groups and other non-white groups, and basically said, well, group B also had discrimination, but they did okay. And this group, also had whatever, and they did okay. And kind of made this almost this case that it had to be something innate about Blackness that was the problem. And the punchline of her terrible story that she told me was like, and this person was Black who did this experiment or did this study or did this paper or whatever. And she was white. And it's so stuck with me, right? So that was just in my subconscious from so long ago. So I think somehow that's how I got to this professor. But then it kind of turned around for me. So I'm a parent, and it really became about the idea of my own hopes and any parent's hopes for their child. So there's this way in the story where the professor says, my desire to groom and shape my son, he's explaining to his son, isn't that different from any other parent? And on the one way, that's a completely ridiculous statement because he's doing these insane things and it doesn't make sense. But in this other way, it's true, right? So we do ask our children, our girls, will go out, dress this way so you'll be safe, or do this and this so that you'll be safe in the world. Or, and describing racism to a child of color is like, it can be its own kind of injury. Just describing it, just saying this may happen to you, but not describing it feels unsafe. So there's this kind of impossible position of being, I think, any parent, but certainly a parent of a child of color. There's this different texture of this one particular thing, and how we deal with it. It can be I find it can be crazy making. And so this is a person who's, broken and twisted under these conditions.
Yeah. It's really interesting to think about parenting through this strange lens that you've created here. And to think about this narrator as a father, which he claims himself to be on the first page, even though his fatherhood is very twisted by this experiment he's chosen to do upon his son. And there's a serious melancholy in this voice. He writes that his early years of struggle made him a solitary sort of man, which is a line that made me quite sad, because this is an addressed story. It's a story that begins with a you. That's the first pronoun that you encounter in it. And reading it for the first time, I was roped in by that you. I felt personally addressed and also implicated, and intimately concerned with what I was being told in a way that's different from sort of unaddressed first person narration. I've often told aspiring writers that I think it's really, really helpful to think about why a story is being told and to whom, that it really focuses one's narrative voice. And you used the addressed first person twice here, both in Controlled Negro and then also in My Monticello, which is in some ways a journal, but also has an intended future readership inside of its own fictional world. And so I wondered why this point of view calls you back over and over again. What do you think it adds to have that specific you in it?
Yeah, for some reason, I really am drawn to second person and to using you. And in fact, I use it not only in My Monticello and Control Negro, but the second story, Virginia's Not Your Home,
Yeah, which
starts with they hung that name on you at birth, but Virginia was never your home. And Buying a House at the Head of the Apocalypse also employs a second person you. So, but in the first two stories, there's a you being addressed, right? So there's this kind of unseen third person or these other groups that the narrator is talking to. I mean, I think it often does rope you in a very specific way, whether the you is you the reader, or it brings you, there's an intimacy, right? So it's risky because it can also push you out, because if the use being described isn't someone you can relate to. But I think in those stories, in each of them in different ways, I did have an intended use. So there's like this triangle between you, the reader, the speaker, and then this other group that you're imagining and that you're getting a shape for. And I think it can be really interesting as a writer, because it just helps you to decide where to press and where to push on things, because you have this other you in the story, you have this other force in the story, which can be really interesting. Generally, though, I think point of view is just so tied to what the story asks for. There's a way in which certain stories just ask for a certain voice, a clear first person telling or a close third person telling. There's just, it really fits. And I have written stories where I've just gone back and rewritten it in a different voice or in a different point of view and had it work better, so that certainly happens as well.
Yeah, it's odd when the story demands something different than what you've started, and it just sort of kicks it into a different gear to change point of view there. It's a great trick, I think, if you feel stuck sometimes, to switch. But I think here that first person is that narrating voice is so intimately connected with those themes, with one of those readings of Control Negro that you described earlier, where there's so much control in this voice, while this man's actions are extremely outsized and wild. Rereading it for, I don't know, maybe the 12th time the other day, I was struck by a parenthetical on the first page where he says that he's outwardly placid. And what it tells us about the reliability of the narrator and the specific protective Blackness of his placidity. He tells us about casual racism that's thrown at him regularly, fellow professors who think he's the janitor. A caricature of a student draws of him titled "Darwin Taught to Men by an Ape." He tells us that he forces himself to laugh, that he tells us he feels tired, and that's it. Feels tired by things. And it reads as a voice that's been flattened by racism, that has sort of double consciousness embedded inside of it, even when he's speaking to his own son. And I wonder how you achieved this voice, like how you honed it. Were you thinking about Du Bois when you conceived it?
So I do think, if you read the story, it is this really flat voice, and it's not my voice as Jocelyn, but that tired, I love it. I love that you pushed on that idea of, he says, he describes all these horrible things and he said, I felt tired, which feels like such an understatement, right? But I think if you say exhausted, right, there's this, like, he's existentially exhausted. And I think I relate to that piece of him, like tired, not like I'm tired, but tired, like I'm so tired, like this is an unbearable weight of tiredness. So yeah, that voice, again, it really came out. Like I went back and found the first draft of the story, and that the beginning of that voice had that to it. And I kind of pulled away anything that wasn't like that, right? In editing, I was like, anything that doesn't keep that sense of just control. Again, going back to the title, this idea of there's a lot under the surface that you're not going to see in this voice. As far as W. Du Bois, I'm going to just confess, I always feel like I haven't really read a ton of W. Du Bois. I'm always like, confessions, I feel like I just want to have read everything, but I did evoke his name in The King of Xandria, another story, because the idea of him, right, is something that I know, this idea of this Pan-Africanist, this idea of the sociologist, this idea of an historian. And so it's funny that it pushes back in the first, King of Xandria, I titled a middle school after him in that. And the fact that we come to this first story and this voice, is of a historian, this history professor, that some of the ideas are just reflected there. And, maybe that's just a happy coincidence of my subconscious mind. But I found this really interesting quote from him from 1897 from Du Bois, Strivings of the Negro People. And I love this because it so sounds like Professor Cornelius Adams, my imagined professor. Du Bois says, how does it feel to be a problem? One ever has his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideas in one dark bodies, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. I mean, it's so like that idea of this double consciousness and all those things are embedded there. And I think there's this way in which, just as people, we inherit the ideas of the past, that they become part of the stories we've seen. And even if we haven't seen the original text, they're in the stories that have seen the text, right? So there's like that idea comes through in this character, even though it's not something that I was aware of or was intending to do.
Yeah, it's striking and thorough and quite beautiful. I think that when I read it for the first time, I think that I'd just been reading Du Bois. And so I think that it immediately struck me as having those formalities that he uses in order to get himself through various barriers in his white readership and things like that. And I mean, and of course your multivalent title just points us back and back and back and back in a circle. There's so many questions of authenticity in this work too. At some point later, the historian writes that his son that you did not appear to be what you said you were. And it struck me that as another multifaceted theme in this work about claiming or taking away a person's authentic identity. And I wondered if you could speak to that a little.
Yeah, so in the story Control Negro, the father is recounting this act of violence, and the police say, we looked at something, your papers, but you didn't appear to be who you said you were. You didn't appear to be who you said you were. And that was actually a real detail from the actual real event that happened here in Charlottesville to the student that I read about and eventually watched the terrible video, which I usually don't do, of this event, this violent kind of confrontation. And for some reason that really struck with me, and I wasn't sure why, because basically they had seen some ID, but they didn't believe it. And in this very weird way, that mirrors the whole story of this, right? Even when you present proof, will you be believed? Do you know what I mean? Even if you come up, give me your papers, here are my papers. Well, that you don't appear to, that doesn't seem right? Because, what are we looking for? But this idea of authenticity, right? This idea of identity, I think identity is so malleable and it's ever changing. And the way that we think of ourselves, not only in terms of race or gender, but in so many ways, is so in conversation and relationship with everything around us and with how we are seen and what we need at that moment. And I think we contain multiple, identities. So it's hard for me to think about an authentic self, because I think we contain so many authentic selves, and we are what's reflected back to us is so much of how we understand ourselves. So, this professor, yes, he's been very shaped by racism, but yet he's very much himself as well. And it's a combination of these things that brings us to the person who would write this letter and perform this experiment and be in this predicament in this story.
Yeah. And in writing the letter too, he's performing this role of a father that he hasn't enacted, but that's also something that he's claiming and hoping to own, which I'm not sure that he can. It's interesting to hear that this story was inspired in part by real events. It's not something that I knew about it before, but I do remember when we were, corresponding years ago, about that horrific Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, and then reading my Monticello, how so many of the events in the novella seem to spring out of that horror that that you lived near. So I wonder what it does for you as a person, or why you feel that churning trauma like that into art is helpful to us.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think so. Why write, certainly in those two stories, and my Monticello for sure, why take something that's traumatic and try to make it into a story or try to make it into art? I think there's a way in which it's a habit of mine, and or I will put it this way. So my persona in the world while I was writing these stories was an elementary school art teacher, like come one, come all at the door, with the chime and like a cardigan and like this very specific way of being, which I loved and was very genuinely me. Um, but then there's a way that I'm noticing everything in the world. So all that beautiful stuff. And then also in the case of August 12th here, people marching down the street saying things like Jews will not replace us, and carrying torches, and talking about this town where I live in a way that is hoping to exclude me from any power in it, and possibly from even an existence in it. And I'm noticing those things too. And so how to reconcile that? So I think for me, writing stories is a place where I can examine things, both just little moments and beautiful things and things I want to remember, but certainly at the core, these like kind of big questions are things that I experience that I have no place for. I don't know what to do with them. With August 12th, I really struggled with what is the right response to this for me, not just for me individually, but for me in relation to my community and what I want in the world. And so wrote the story almost to kind of think through and figure out how to be in relation to it. And I think in the story, it doesn't answer the question of how to be in relation to it, except for that, for me, making art is how to be in relation to it. And that I do believe in this idea of community, right? There's a way in which you have to create coalition around your response to it. And the story gives you that, but not an answer beyond that, really, not really. And so I think, I just think that is one of the ways that I exist in the world, and that I manage things, even when no one's going to read it, or when, it doesn't become part of a book, a debut book. But just writing can be a really interesting way, and art making can be a really interesting way to respond and to write to yourself and figure out how to manage something. It's like a processing, managing thing.
But I think your discussion of the unanswerable is really interesting, because sometimes these problems are so big that like there's no answer, there's no simple solution. And it often feels to me that instead there's a whole gigantic host of interconnected questions that art is best at asking, better certainly than the studies in controlled Negro, or some of our political discourse, that asking and changing and thinking about stuff in a fuller and more honest way might be the only way to get us anywhere.
I so agree. I think asking questions and looking at things, not, I have beliefs of what I think is right and wrong in certain circumstances, but I don't know everything and I don't understand everything. And so there's a way in which I'm really interested in complicating things, even for myself and for my characters, and not presenting them. I think one of the biggest compliments that I've heard from like 3 different people is like, this is not a polemic. This is not like Jocelyn believes this, and then she's going to write a story to convey this. So I think stories are so important and they're so powerful, but not just because they can manipulate you into believing something or even convince you into believing something. I wanted to sit with the not knowing and sit with characters who believe things I believe, and also ones that are doing things that I absolutely don't stand by, but I still feel their humanity and I understand how they might come to those moments. And, anything that's complicated or nuanced for me, I love that in stories when something is just doesn't quite fit where I wanted it to, and it's an agitation, and it makes me, you know, look at it anew and think about it in this different way, or just sit with it. Just sit with it and see it. It's almost like it allows you to see something that in race relations, we all, both Black and white people, and, all kinds of Americans think we know, or we have a feeling, or we have experiences, or we're in our place, but it's so much more than that. And I think there's a way in which stories can peel back some of the things we think we know and leave us in a space of listening and wondering again.
Yeah, I think your work does that so incredibly powerfully. That's one of the things that strikes me about every work in this collection, is it makes me experience very, very viscerally something unresolvable, something contradictory, and immensely powerful. And I think one of the ways that you do this is through your, it's just, through the actual craft of fiction. I have above my desk, I have a quote from Vivian Gornick that reads, "The way the narrator sees things is to the largest degree the thing being seen," which I keep as a reminder to myself that imagery and figurative language is doing just as much work as the events or dialogue in a story. And your imagery is simple and efficient, almost without exception. Even just on the first paragraph of page 2, you talk about plush white Pampers on this baby, and one-way glass, the baby's fat curled fingers grasping blocks. And each of those images that seem mundane in and of themselves is doing so much work. And I wonder how you come to your images and how you think about revising a work for maximum control of that aesthetic space.
Yeah. So, I think my favorite thing about writing, or when it feels like it's working, is when you're really seeing things through the eyes of the character, even if it's a third person story. So there's a way in which everything that happens in the story, and every analogy that's used in the story, is giving you character. Like, there's almost a way, like, why did something happen? Well, it's to show you how that character would respond to it.
Right.
The world is through the eyes of that character. There isn't just the world, there's the world, kind of filtered through. So for example, Cornelius, everything he's noticing, even these moments of lushness, are kind of like giving you the care that he has for this kid, even though he's completely separated from him, right? So it's giving you that internal world of his that's below, the surface a little bit, right? When he gives these moments of fleshness. Or I think of in the King of Xandria, it really stands out to me because that's a story in the third person of this Nigerian father, and he's talking about, his experience, but it's he, Mr. Atta did this. In fact, he's not even a first name. He's Mr. Atta. There's this distance from him, but everything he describes is the words that he uses to describe the world are showing you his idea of self-importance and pompousness, but also like his vulnerability, because it's not quite right. He's in a language that isn't his first language. He's in a place that isn't his home place that he understands, where he felt powerful and where he had things under control. And so, that story really relies on this idea of migratory birth, because this family is immigrating from one place to another. So it has, all those little details are kind of giving you this character, and hopefully putting you in a piece of mind, in a place of mind where you can relate to him and feel for him.
Makes sense. One of the things that I find very compelling about your work throughout this book, that's a concern of mine as well, is the way that concerns about climate change run parallel to concerns about race and about America. In New Orleans, obviously the events following Katrina made that very, very apparent to us and to anyone who was paying attention. But I wonder how you connect those ideas, because you do return to them over and over and over again.
Yeah, that's like that's a really strong through line in the stories, this idea of the climate in relation to systemic racism. I think both things were top of mind to me, but I think they're both so related to one another, at least in two ways. So one way is that I think the way that you do anything is the way you do everything. And so the way that we are willing to plunder a group of people and, treat a community less than another, or to just think of the history of chattel slavery, like take wealth from a community and not, to this grander purpose of the American idea, right, is not totally dissimilar from the way that we treat, our environment, the way that we, without any sense of moderation or care or replenishment, are willing to take, and there's no limit. It's not like, okay, we'll take 25%. It's just like, if we're going to just, we're going to do whatever gives us a penny more, right? Or gives this person a penny more. But then there's also this really interesting way, which I think people might not think about, but it's just a distraction, right? So it's kind of like having people pitted against one another, or creating an other that that you can tell one group, well, everything is their fault. It's the fault of these people and these people and these people. And then sowing those seeds distracts us from the other problems that we could be working on. So that idea is really prevalent in my Monticello. Like, there's these issues that, the Knox character, this white character, is like, no, we really need to be working on the environment. We need all hands on deck. Whereas other people are like, it's those people's fault. Let's fight with them and have a war. And this, and I think it benefits the truly powerful to have people at odds with one another, to divide and not have people be able to see the way they are connected, and the way that they are connected to the climate and to the earth. And I think it serves some people in the short term, but no one in the long term. In my opinion, it serves no one in the long term. And I think there's a way in which, if we could tackle one, if we can reckon with one thing, we could reckon with both things, or the same kinds of things are needed to reckon with one and reckon with the other.
Yeah. It's amazing how the compassion that you access in dealing with one thing immediately starts to, explode out, so that you have compassion for all creatures, human and non-human, that we share this planet and this continent with. And I think you're right that the division is something that is so aptly dealt with in my Monticello through your main character there, who is she's such a beautiful leader of a person. She's so full of love and spends so much time trying to bring all of the motley crew of people who take refuge at my Monticello, at her Monticello, at Monticello, after this disaster. She reminds me of one of Octavia Butler's heroines, for instance. And I was wondering, where your heroines come from, because of course we've been talking about Control Negro and this very difficult, complicated hero, but you have a lot of extraordinarily strong women in this collection as well.
Yeah, that's yeah. I just finished reading Wild Seed again by Octavia Butler on my Kindle late last night. So my Monticello Denasia, where does she come from? Well, in actuality, she came from that particular heroine, right? Came from seeing a real person again. Like, so when I was in the aftermath of August 12th here, and a year later, I went to an event where the descendant stood up in the audience, who was a Black woman who was descended from Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, or she was introduced that way. And I thought, oh my gosh, she lives here. And I think I've said this before, but literally I saw her pumping gas. Like, I just happened to see her again, like the next week. And it was so striking to me somehow. And then for some reason that connected me to her in this sense, her physicality being similar to mine. And then that connected August 12th in Charlottesville, where we had this Unite the Right rally, which was really terrible, to Thomas Jefferson and Monticello, which sits right outside of town. And what is the relationship between those two things? And somehow this character, this person that I imagine kind of connected these things because she was a townie. She's a person who lives here. She's a person who both went through the public schools here, but then also is going to Thomas Jefferson's premier university here in town. And she has this tie to Monticello. She has several ties, but she has this biological tie through her family history and through her mom and grandma. So I think it was so fun to come up with this person who was going to be a hero, but she's a hero in this very specific way, right? So she's a young woman, a young Black woman who is very smart and capable, but isn't like, running out leading the charge. She's using like her wit, her vulnerability, her care, her even her anguish and her kind of like PTSD to push people to do the right thing in this very specific way. And I think it's neat to put a character in a heroine position, but not necessarily give them the traits that you see that are the cliche or the very expected traits of a leader. So I think she's like an unusual leader because I thought, what would the person who could do all those things, who could survive at UVA, this specific person, what might she do? Who's wanting to be a teacher? How would that person be a hero? Like, how would that person lead a charge? It would be different, right? And so that's what I was thinking about with her. Would you like me to read just the first paragraph of my Monticello?
That would be wonderful. I love that.
It just occurs to me then it would give an idea of the voice of that story.
Sure.
So I'm just going to read literally the first paragraph of that story. This is the novella that takes up a really big chunk of the book, most of the book. My Monticello. We claimed it first, this little mountain, me and Ma Violet and a scattering of neighbors, all of us fleeing First Street after men came to set our row of 10-roofed homes on fire. The men came at dusk, blaring an operatic, "Oh, say, can you see?" White heads rose up from dusty jeeps and dark-haired thrash in a harsh new wind, like tattered flags. "Ours," the men shouted. Their rifles gleamed as if they'd only just been bought. A megastore militia. Through the hasty breach in Ma Violet's blinds, I even saw a boy among them, blonde and sneering in a pickup window. Men leapt from back seats, sprang out of truck beds, and rushed towards the faces of our homes. White hands clutched metal canisters, swung torches spilling flames. Bright shouts, the rising haze of smoke, all that and more rousted us out. From our patchy front yards, we saw bodies blur as some of our neighbors charged forward to try to stop them. We saw a teen struck with the butt of a rifle, his temples spraying red. A toddler flailed, diapered and clinging to its mother's hip as she sank knees first to the sidewalk. What we saw in those moments riveted us, and then it set us free.
It's such an extraordinary story. I was just feeling it wash over me and rivet me, and I might have to go and read it again for the fourth time this afternoon. But I think that one thing that really strikes me about your work and about the novella in particular is how unflinching it is, how willing it is to look into the face, not just of these dystopian possibilities in the future, but what's happening right now. In Amitav Ghosh's book about writing about climate change, The Great Derangement, he talked about how, the realist novel is in some ways like a tool of the hegemonic forces that keep things like systemic racism and the plundering of our natural environment going. And it just seems so important to me that we have work like yours that doesn't try to smooth everything over, that that allows itself to look directly into the face of this mob, which is at once a future mob and a past mob, and a mob happening right now. Um, and I wonder if that is one of your intentions, to just try to tell the truth in your fiction.
Absolutely, but I don't think there's just one truth, but I definitely in that was trying to tell the truth of how it felt to me to see that. And that included in it, um, all the things I witnessed, all the worry and anticipation, all the aftermath, the heartbreak of thinking of my parents seeing it and my people that I knew and my child seeing it, and then what came after it and how it was contextualized. It's always so important when you think about a story. So I really, and even when I thought about talking about the past, about Thomas Jefferson, I really wanted to be both accurate in the details that I included, but also truthful in how I felt about those things. And I think there's a way in which I have been taught myself not to do that.
Yeah.
There's a certain safety in not not dealing with things, not looking at things too closely, not, you're really taught, oh, don't make a big deal about certain things. Racism is like really inconvenient to bring up. No one really wants to, no, it's awkward. And there's a way in which you want to smooth it over. Yes, those people were horrible. Knox says in the story, the white boyfriend. But there's so many good people. Yes, there are really a lot of good people. That's absolutely true. And that should be stated. But that doesn't erase this other thing too. How can you hold these two contradictory things in your mind at the same time? How can you look at something and also recognize your own fallibility, your own ability to plunder, right? Just because you're a person of color doesn't mean that your own, my character at one point is full of rage and does something I think that is not what she would hope she would do. And that's human. That's a very human thing to do. And so I think that I was trying to be truthful, and there was a way in which it let me just put a container around something that's kind of unmanageable and huge and horrible.
Yeah. And sometimes it feels like it's just the container of that one specific human narrating voice. That's kind of the only container that those sort of things can be held by. Do you feel when you're writing about these things that you need to take special care of yourself?
I mean, yeah, I don't know, you have to be in a certain place. And I wrote these stories while I was teaching full time. I'm a mom, I have a partner, and so I'd have to be in one place and then kind of move to another. But they did kind of suck me into, the world of them. There was a way in which when I was writing these stories, I'd be teaching at school and I would email myself a note of, oh, this is what someone should say, or did I remember this little bit, or I bet this, or something would happen in the world. And I would want to tuck it in there. I have a little sliver of it in the story. But I don't know if I did take as good a care of myself as maybe one should, except for that, there is something so cathartic and hopeful about making something. And then I was like, I'm handing it, the hopefulness to me in that story and in the collection is that I'm like, here are stories of some of my greatest fears and worries. And now I'm going to hand it to you, reader. And then you can sit with it with me and we can share it. And that's that community building piece. And then from there, maybe we can do something different together that will make, if things can get worse, which I have seen in my lifetime, then things can also get better. And so each moment we're making what the future will be. And maybe if we sit in this space together, we can make it look a little bit more safe for everybody.
It's such a beautiful way to think about writing and reading. I hope that all of our listeners out there and all of your readers are receiving it with the same amount of generosity with which you've given it to us. It's it's such an extraordinary book of different writings, and I am so grateful to have encountered it. And I hope that everyone, all of you, will be just as grateful as I am. Are you working on anything new now?
I am. I'm working on something new, and I'm still pretty early days, but I have like the seed of what I want to do, and I'm excited to see what it becomes. I feel like it's always like a miracle if something comes together, but I have that initial like idea of voice and of who and of what the force of them at the middle of the story will be. So I'm excited about that.
That's wonderful. That's good news for us all.
Thank you. You're so kind. I really appreciate you finding that story, and I'm so glad that we've been in connection ever since. That makes me really happy.
Me too. Me too. It's such a pleasure to know your voice, and I hope that at some point we'll get to meet each other in person.
Me in real life, exactly, not on Zoom. Yeah.
Well, everyone, please don't forget to go out to your independent bookstore and get a copy of My Monticello by Jocelyn Nicole Johnson. We really appreciate your being here with us at the Tennessee Williams and New Orleans Literary Festival. And I hope that, next year on Royal Street, as they say. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jocelyn.
Thank you. Thank you, Morgan.